Vladimir Putin made a surprise visit to Mariupol over the weekend. This was his first visit to the Donbas region since the war commenced over a year ago. The trip came in the aftermath of the International Criminal Court's issuing an arrest warrant for the Russian president, which many global leaders have backed. I'm joined now by Professor of US Politics at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin, Scott Lucas. Scott, good morning.
Very good morning to you, Pat.
I suppose we should point out, as Putin ignores the arrest warrant by the ICC, that the United States also does not have any truck with the ICC.
Yes, I mean, this goes back to the 1990s, Pat, when the International Criminal Court was being set up, and the Clinton administration pressed for the U.S. to be a member of it, but Congress continued to block any American accession. And indeed, it was notable that even as most American outlets said that it was good that an arrest warrant was served on Vladimir Putin, you had outlets like the Wall Street Journal who said, but no. It would be a bad precedent if we let this happen too often because America cannot be part of the ICC.
So therefore, any glee that might be expressed in America has to be it's got to be really indicated by the US's own reluctance to be part of the ICC.
Well, yes, Pat, and in fact, we've got this, coincidence this week that as Vladimir Putin is served with the arrest warrant, it's the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And you'll know all too well that there are allegations both about whether the actual invasion itself constituted a breaking of international law and whether conduct of American troops during that war also broke international law. And so that only reinforces a section of opinion amongst some Americans, not all Americans, but some Americans, that if you join the ICC, it means that, oh gosh, they may actually prosecute our boys and our leaders, and we could never have that.
So the arrest warrant has been issued and it has garnered approval in many quarters of the globe. But what's its impact?
Well, I think, first of all, we should say, Pat, that despite the U.S. not being part of the ICC, you're quite right to say that the large part of the international community, which is part of the court, is supporting this. And the immediate impact on Vladimir Putin is going to be very limited. We don't expect it, anybody's going to sweep in and, frog march him out of the Kremlin to face trial. The fact is if Vladimir Putin stays within Russia, it is highly unlikely that he'll ever be held accountable for the crimes of his invasion unless he is forced from power and handed over to the court, as happened with Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia more than 20 years ago. But there is a limited practical effect, Pat, which is that Putin cannot travel to any country which is a member of the ICC without fear of being arrested. For example, he's due in South Africa in August at what's called the BRICS Summit. South Africa is a member of the ICC, so Putin would risk being arrested if he shows up there. And I think beyond the practical effect, this is an important symbolic marker, Pat, and that is that we know from reports which have been issued just in recent days by a UN independent commission that there have been multiple war crimes committed. We know that there's the specific war crime of the deportation of Ukrainian children, thousands of Ukrainian children, to Russia. And as the ICC lead judge said, we are making this warrant public to try to deter this from happening in future and to set this up as a marker that this is simply not acceptable under any decent norm of international law.
Because although there have been war crimes committed by soldiers in the field and they are being documented by Ukrainian investigators and international investigators at the moment, being able to apply those battlefield crimes to Putin might be a legal stretch.
There is a dispute going on right now, Pat, amongst legal experts. There are some who question whether the ICC, under its current jurisdiction, can actually go as far as to charge the Russian leadership for crimes that are committed in the field, including the deportations. And that has led some to call for a special tribunal. Think about the tribunals that followed World War II, for example. And indeed, there was a meeting only a couple of weeks ago amongst the attorney generals and head of justice departments of dozens of countries to consider that special tribunal. I think that legal consideration, whether you prosecute through the ICC or a special tribunal, will continue. But again, what is important is that we at least have a recognition that not just in principle, but in reality, Vladimir Putin should face some type of international accountability for whatever his forces are conducting in Ukraine, and that he cannot plead ignorance of the war crimes committed in the name of his invasion.
So his world has definitely become smaller as a result of this arrest warrant being issued. I'm just wondering, does it make a peace much more complicated? Because a peace for Vladimir Putin would probably, for him, result in a reappearance on the world stage. But with this arrest warrant hanging over him, that's never going to happen.
Well, I think the fundamental here is, Pat, that with or without the arrest warrant, there's no evidence in the foreseeable future that Vladimir Putin's going to enter into negotiations. He would actually have to lose on the battlefield, and lose heavily on the battlefield, I think, to finally give up the dream of trying to conquer Ukraine. So I don't think the ICC judgment changes those dynamics. I think what the ICC decision does is something a little bit different, which is important, and that is, it continues to put out a signal to Putin that he cannot find an escape hatch, including today, as he meets the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, by claiming that Russia, or at least Putin's Russia, is a decent part of the international community. Putin, at the same time that he's trying to conquer Ukraine, will still continue to put out the propaganda that this is a justified invasion, that he's standing up against the so-called West, against the U.S., and against Europe. He'll claim that he's the victim here. The ICC's recognition of the war crimes shows that Putin is not a victim. And I think that right now is a higher consideration than, how this might affect Putin's political calculations in the near future. Because in the near future, no, he's not going to give up on this war for Ukraine, whether or not he faces a defeat at some point in the future.
Now, the question of that trip to Mariupol, I heard on radio that he had visited a theatre, and I thought, he's mixed with the punters in the theatre. Then I saw the picture. He was all on his ownio, virtually.
Yeah,
himself and one other person, 3 seats apart, in case the other person tried to stab him or something. I don't know, but it looked very odd.
It is very strange. I mean, the reason for this, Pat, to show him in the theater is you might remember that the main drama theater in Mariupol was bombed by the Russians last spring as they tried to overrun the city, and that an estimated 300 civilians died in that bombing while they were sheltering there. So what the point of that photo op was Putin saying, look, here I am, a man of culture in a theater, even if there weren't many people around him, to try to wipe away the fact that those hundreds of civilians had died. In the same way that there were these very strange staged managed appearances where he would meet a few residents who would come up to him in the center of Mariupol and say, thank you so much. Thank you for our rebuilt apartments. Thank you for standing up for us, dear leader. And in one of those strange moments, as those so-called residents, because we're not sure they're residents, come up to greet Putin, you hear someone off camera shout at him, this is not true. None of this is true. And the Russian officials didn't catch that. And so that video went up on the president's website where you hear someone heckling this staged managed appearance. In other words, Pat, this was not a vision of reality. It was a PR exercise for 2 reasons. One is that as his troops struggle on the battlefield in eastern Ukraine, Putin is still trying to show that he could win this conflict. And secondly, there is infighting going on in Moscow. There are those, such as the head of the Wagner Group mercenaries, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who are fighting with the Russian Defense Ministry. And Putin is trying to now intervene amidst that infighting for the first time by saying, this is my war. Here I am in Ukraine. Will that succeed in quelling the infighting in Moscow? More importantly, can it reverse the fortunes of his troops on the battlefield? We'll see.
Now, finally, Scott, the visit of President Xi to Moscow to meet with Putin, the agenda, I mean, we'll be told something publicly, but the private agenda, I mean, Putin may be looking to buy arms from China, flogging energy to China in return. Maybe there'll be some sort of scientific and technical assistance in the manufacture of armaments in Russia. But does China have another agenda to try and bring about a peace?
Well, more importantly, Pat, China has its own agenda to get advantage for Beijing out of this conflict. What you're going to see over the next 2 days is you'll see the photos of Vladimir Putin and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. You'll have the token statements that you always have about strategic cooperation, the memoranda for economic links that will be signed. The reality here is that Putin is looking to get out of his isolation and out of his military situation with a friend, a very powerful friend. But the Chinese do not want to tie themselves to an invasion which might fail. What do they want? The first is they are now becoming a global diplomatic heavyweight. We saw this in their brokering of the resumption of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia just a few days ago. They would very much like, they don't expect it to happen, but they would like to be the broker of a settlement over Ukraine's war. But if they don't get that settlement, they want to continue to balance between Putin and the rest of the world by saying, and this is very important, in their 12-point plan, respect the sovereignty of all countries. Why is that important? With that one phrase, respect the sovereignty, not just of Russia, but of Ukraine, they maintain some distance from Vladimir Putin's invasion. And I think most importantly, Pat, beyond that, they're on notice, not just by the US, but by Europe and by most of the international community, that if they supply lethal military assistance to Russia to get Putin out of a jam, that crosses a red line. And I don't think the Chinese want to go there, whatever the pomp and ceremony you see over the next 48 hours.
Just one final technical point. I mean, they maintain that Taiwan is part of China and therefore respecting the sovereignty of nations would not include Taiwan from their perspective. Could the same thing be said for Russia, who maintains that Ukraine, all of it, is part of great Mother Russia?
They may try to maintain that, Vladimir Putin may try to maintain that, but China has never recognized the annexations of the 4 regions that Putin claimed last September, 2 in the east of Ukraine, 2 in the south. I think the only countries who have recognized those annexations are North Korea, Syria, and Belarus. Not exactly the biggest heavyweight lineup you want to have on you as you try to conquer your neighbor.